All right. Thank you so much for having me out. It's really great to be here. I really enjoyed my stay. So what I do want to start with might be sort of one of the kind of American equivalents of Klaus Scherer, our appraisal theorist from way back in the day, Richard Lazarus and Bob Zients. And when I was in graduate school, this debate that they had in the early 80s was still pretty fresh in memory. It sort of got discussed in multiple classes. I think it was kind of the second great emotion debate that I'm aware of. And it started with Bob Zients writing this paper, an American psychologist, titled Feeling and Thinking Preferences Need No Inferences. And I think Bob was a little bent out of shape over cognitive psychology's ascendancy and the idea that cognition sort of ran everything in the mind. And so he wasn't interested in that idea. And he said, no, emotion doesn't come after all this cognition. The very first stage of the organism's reaction to stimuli are affective. Of course, this didn't sit very well with appraisal theorists. At the time, folks like Richard Lazarus, who wrote a reply. Back then, replies took a couple years to come out in the same journal. We had no internet yet. And so he wrote a piece called Thoughts on the Relations Between Emotions and Cognition. And he just sort of bluntly stated, no, thought is a necessary condition of emotion. And then he also sort of added maybe a bit of a caveat or a clarification to try to get him and Bob on the same page. He said that the cognitive activity in appraisal does not imply anything about deliberate reflection. So he's saying, yeah, I'm talking about cognitive activity, but maybe it's not about what you're calling thought. And he said, but always cognition comes before affect. Cognition comes before emotion. And this just continued to frustrate Bob, who responded in kind 2 years later. All of these papers were cited thousands and thousands and thousands of times. Like replies to replies don't usually get cited 3,000 times, but in this case, they did. And Bob just felt that Richard Lazarus was cheating by trying to sneak cognition into everything. And he said, if we accept Lazarus's positions, all distinctions between cognition, perception, and sensation disappear. Now, after this debate, there was definitely some confusion about sort of where sort of the field should go, how we should think about things. And I think ultimately there was a fair bit of consensus that a lot of the debate was actually sort of semantic. They were kind of talking past each other. They meant different things by cognition. Zients is talking about emotion more in terms of like a snake coming at you, and it's a clear visual stimulus that we're evolutionarily encoded to respond to. And Lazarus is talking about more sort of complex human emotions that may not involve you seeing anything at all. And so this would be the end of it, but I think that appraisal theorists kind of went on to sort of muddy the water for themselves. And I say this as someone who's sympathetic to appraisal theory as a general idea, but back in the 80s, there were a couple things that happened. The first of which was that Lazarus and Susan Folkman published this book, Stress, Appraisal, and Coping. And it is, one of the sort of most successful books in the history of psychology. This book was cited over 8,000 times last year. It was cited over 8,000 times last year. It's been cited about 110,000 times in total. And in this book, they quoted Magda Arnold, who was one of the very first appraisal theorists, and she said, appraisal is immediate and indeliberate. If we see someone stab at our eye with his finger, we avoid the threat instantly. This appraisal of potential harm must be similarly immediate. And this first sentence about appraisal being indeliberate, that seems consistent with what Lazarus was just saying in response. She's saying the appraisal happens first, but it doesn't involve deliberate thought. But this time, Lazarus and Folkman, they didn't seem okay to accept this view from one of their own, from another appraisal theorist, and they replied saying, our emphasis is much more on complex, meaning-related cognitive activity. Appraisals go far beyond immediate and indeliberate cognitive affective responses. So I think, he's sort of going back and forth with whether he's willing to commit to the idea that cognition doesn't actually imply thought. And then I think the other problem that appraisal theorists had for many years, and actually Klaus, I will mention Klaus. Klaus was one of the people I think who helped move appraisal type models past this. But for decades, the approach that appraisal folks took, like this paper from Ira Roseman, but I could have picked any number of papers, they would have their appraisal dimensions that they wanted to assess, and they would ask someone to retrieve some emotional event from memory from the last couple of weeks. And then they would ask them questions like, at the time, did you believe that the occurrence of this event was an injustice to you? At the time, how much did you think that this event was caused by circumstances beyond anyone's control? And so what's going on here is now that the event is in distant memory, they would ask people to sort of deliberate about what the appraisals had been at the time, and they're using very propositional language, and they're imputing that back to a moment when none of that type of propositional thinking might have taken place. So the language about believing and thinking, I'm not sure that those things were happening at the time. And so I think there is a real issue that still sort of exists in the residue of the Lazarus and Zients debate that I think is still sort of a problem to be solved, which is, from a neuroscience perspective, what kind of mechanisms in the brain can do both of these two things, can process the information that's relevant to generating emotion fast enough so that it fits our phenomenology of how emotions unfold, but also in that same mechanism that's fast enough can produce a high-dimensional emotional state space of appraisals where you've got this, very fast process and a very nuanced process. How do we find a system that can do both of these things? And actually, I think there's a third requirement because we think there's such a strong correlation between appraisals and the conscious experience, right? That's how it was all studied, is that if we know how you appraise the situations, then we also probably know what kind of emotion you felt. And so this multidimensional emotional appraisal state space also has to be then collapsed into a single conscious emotion at any given point in time. And so we're looking for a mechanism that is fast, nuanced, and integrative. And those, I will say, are in short supply in the brain. There's not a lot that do all three of these things. If we look to the sort of standard cast of characters in emotion research, the amygdala, the ventral striatum, the insula, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, I'm not sure if any of these fit the bill. Now, all of these are incredibly important to emotion writ large, the whole topic of emotion. But when we think about appraisal processes and conscious emotional experience, I'm not sure that these play quite that role, especially the first two of these. And so, I think part of the issue is that we spent so many years focused on how to account for the kinds of thoughts that go with appraisals that we might have been sort of barking up the wrong tree. I don't know if that metaphor works here, but looking in the wrong place. And for me, a big sort of transition point was reading the work of Nico Frida, who was a very big influence on me. And in his book, The Emotions, he wrote that emotional experience is primarily a perception, a mode of appearance of the situation. Emotional experience is perception of horrible objects, insupportable people, oppressive events. And then he went on to say, this is one of my favorite lines in anything I've ever read in psychology, it should be possible to present for every emotion a corresponding description of what the world looks like to the subject. And so there's this move that's a little bit subtle, but there's this move from thought to perception as kind of the locus of where appraisal processes are happening. And this is interesting because perception, visual perception, seems to have both a lot of speed and a lot of nuance, right? I mean, we have so much nuance in what we see in any given moment of the world. But I think it does get a little bit more complicated than that. See, because when we think about the word seeing, I think we all naturally tend to turn to the kind of seeing that involves light hitting the retina and going to the back of the brain and then being converted into visual experience. But I actually think that there is a broader definition of seeing that goes beyond the visual that we usually think of first. And this is something that we can understand in terms of effortless meaning making. And so I think, yeah, okay. You do that to all the outside visitors, right? And so I think that effortless meaning making gets at seeing in a different sort of way. And I think that this might have been what Nico Frito was talking about when I sort of flesh it out a little bit. See, when you see this scene, right, you immediately see it as sensible as a lake with mountains in the distance and clouds and trees in the foreground. And you don't have to think your way to any of these insights, right? We don't think thought is involved in this, but there is a lot of meaning involved in this. There's a lot of intuitive understanding that is going on here. And it turns out that there are other kinds of conscious experiences that also involve effortless meaning making, but are not necessarily visual, and yet we comfortably use the word seeing to describe those as well. For instance, here we see that the baby wants the toy, but of course wanting, desire, is a psychological state and you can't see it. But there's a sense in which we feel like we see it, right? There's this weird sense in which we feel like we do see it, even though technically you can't. Same thing with this woman. We can see that she is happy, not merely that she is smiling. We feel like we kind of see her happiness through her smile. And while the smile is the cue, the happiness is the thing that we actually psychologically engage with and feel like we are seeing. But these might feel a little bit like cheats to you because there is a lot of visual content here. But then we can go to a situation where we're talking to someone on the phone. So we can't see them at all. We can't see anything relevant. And they might sort of explain their perspective on something to us. And after they finish, we might say back to them, you know what? I see what you mean. Or, actually, I see things differently. Right? We use this language of seeing to talk about this sort of intuitive understanding of what another person says, even when there's nothing visual going on at all. And I wanted to make sure that this wasn't just an accident of English. So I checked what I think are all the languages that tend to be represented in this room in Switzerland. And you can do the same thing in all the languages over here. At least that's what AI tells me. So I don't actually speak. I took a year of regular German and a year of regular French, and I couldn't tell you. That was 30 years ago. But apparently you can. And the truth is, I've seen this in almost every language around the world, that there's a word that you can comfortably use to talk about seeing a mountain and saying, I see what you mean. The only exceptions are East Asian languages. They don't have this feature. They do it in noun form instead of verb form. I could talk about that if folks care about that. So we have these very different types of seeing that feel like very different categories of responses that are sort of under this same umbrella. And I think that what brings them together is seeing, but the way I like to sort of reference it is as seeing with a C. And that's because I wrote a psych review paper a few years ago that was called the Seeing Model of Pre-Reflective Subjective Construal. And just to sort of unpack that, pre-reflective means without thought, conscious but without thought. And subjective construal is how social psychologists talk about kind of understanding what's happening kind of in the situation you're in right now. So seeing is an acronym, and seeing stands for coherent, effortless experiences that have the same intuitive givenness of visual experiences, visual processing. So visual processing is definitely sort of the standard, but I think there's other things that have this similar phenomenological state of this effortless meaning making, and when that happens, we're very comfortable using the word seeing to describe that. So seeing is about our moment-to-moment, idiosyncratic way of making sense of the world and doing it without having to stop and think about it. And I think a lot of seeing kind of operates a bit like heads-up displays. Okay, so if you don't have these in your car now, you probably will in the next 5 years. If you've ever worn AR goggles, that is a heads-up display. VR can be a heads-up display. And I think that a lot of the way that we pre-reflectively make sense of the world is with a series of heads-up displays that are built into our brain. Just to give you sort of the simplest and most obvious example, color is a heads-up display, right? We all learned at a relatively young age, I'm guessing, that color does not exist in the world, right? Galileo was very frustrated with the fact that color does not exist in the world and said we should ignore it altogether, because we obviously could never say anything scientific about that. It's just in our heads. And we humans see color differently than most other animals. Even most primates only see this spectrum of color, but we humans see yellow, reds, oranges. And it appears, what evolutionary psychologists argue, is that the reason why we developed an additional cone for seeing reds, yellows, and oranges is because it served a very critical evolutionary purpose, which is it allowed us to know when fruit was ripe. Okay, and when we were evolving our much larger brains, we needed every calorie we could get, and animals all were just going for green fruits, and humans were one of the only animals that could identify the red, yellow, and orange fruits. Now, of course, they weren't actually red, yellow, and orange, right? Because there is no color in the world. But what we do know is that as fruit becomes ripe, its calorie content increases, and the spectra of light it reflects changes. And so our brains built this heads-up display to give us a very efficient way to make sense of where there is ripe fruit in the environment. And so humans got to pick all the ripe fruit, and other animals were stuck picking all the green stuff because they couldn't tell the difference. So I think we have heads-up displays for color, obviously, but also for emotional expressions, right? We see the emotions behind these facial configurations, which there's no reason that has to be true, but that is how we see people. We also have lots of social heads-up displays where we can look at these folks and immediately know without thinking which two are close and connected and which two are strangers. We can look and see which two have care and concern for each other and which two, or in this case 3, really don't seem to like each other very much. And I think we have a whole series of different kinds of heads-up displays that we use to make sense of the social world. And it's not layering on color, like the example we had before. I think it's layering on heads-up displays in terms of our psychological reactions, but I think they function in pretty similar ways. And so I don't think it's a huge stretch then to say, well, maybe what our brain is already doing to sort of get situational meaning effortlessly and pre-reflectively could be extended to sort of getting at a variety of the appraisal dimensions that, every model has its own different set of appraisal dimensions, so this isn't any particular set of those. And so the question, that I have is, are there any brain regions that have this capacity to see, with a C, the high dimensional emotional state space of appraisals? And so for this next sort of segment, what I'm going to do is switch gears and talk about 3 different kinds of computer chips because they represent different architectures. And I think we have different parts of the brain that sort of operate roughly, not perfectly, but roughly along the principles of these 3 architectures. Do you guys have Goldilocks and the 3 Bears here? Is that a familiar story? Yes? Okay. So it's going to be just like that. The first 2 are going to be wrong. The third one's going to be just right, hopefully. Hopefully you'll think it's just right. So the first one is sort of our old classic workhorse, central processing units, CPUs. We'll talk about graphic processing units, GPUs, and then tensor processing units, or TPUs. And CPUs have been around as long as I've been alive, which is a while, and they are known for being incredibly flexible, able to implement just about any command, but they also are slow because they implement one command at a time, and that's kind of what each chip does. And the assumption is the prefrontal cortex kind of works like a CPU. In fact, the paper in 1974 that first dubbed the prefrontal cortex the central executive used synonymously in that paper the term central processor. So they were using the exact same language of CPUs, which are central processing units. So I don't think it's great from that perspective in terms of the speed that you would want for appraisal generation. There's another feature that I think is interesting. This is from a paper just from last year where this group looked at the extent to which different brain regions are either insulated from or receive a lot of input from sensory areas of the brain. And both lateral and medial prefrontal cortex were both regions that were some of the most insulated from getting any sensory inputs. And I think if you're going to be doing sort of the core components of appraisal, you need to be combining inputs from the world with inputs from your internal state and sort of integrating those together. And I think this is sort of another nudge against that being what the prefrontal cortex does. We also know from work going back to Patricia Goldman-Rakich and this more recent work that the prefrontal cortex tends to have little tiny cortical patches that are very different from each other, and it's almost like there's walls between them that keep the information highly segregated so that you don't get bleeding together of sort of the representational information. And so that's, again, not something that promotes integration. It's more focused on segregation. And so I think prefrontal cortex, not the best candidate for being kind of the central performer in the appraisal space. So next, we have GPUs, which became popular in the 1990s because they made video games run faster, right? So CPUs, when they wanted to do graphics, the one CPU had to paint this pixel, and then this pixel, and then this pixel, and this pixel. And so they came up with GPUs, which had thousands of cores, which could paint all the pixels at the same time. So you have speed, and the GPU runs in parallel, but it is very segregated so that this pixel never gets affected by what's happening down in this pixel. So it has a spatial arrangement to the way these GPUs work. And the way they work is a single command is broadcast to all the cores, like shade all the pixels. And so then each little core does a computation that takes its current state, the light source, combines that, and gets that pixel's new color. Okay? And they're kept separate from each other. Now, in visual cortex, we have much the same thing happening, right? So you've got this fire hose of visual information coming in from the thalamus, and it goes to these highly segregated, spatially arranged layout in the earliest layers of the visual cortex, V1, right? So V1 is famously called retinotopic, and that means, the part of the cortex that's up here corresponds to a particular part of the spatial field, and the spot that's down here corresponds to a different part. And so just like with the GPUs, they tend to keep their information processing separate, and there'll be a broad command like detect edges, which is something V1 does, but it's done relatively independently by all these kind of neural cores throughout V1 and V2 and so on. So you've got the speed, but I don't think you're seeing the kind of integration that you'd want to see for something involving appraisal. I'll skip over this bit, but there's some really nice features of the sort of layers of the cells themselves that explain why V1 keeps the data very segregated, and some other areas don't do that quite as much. Our last stop on this part of the tour are TPUs, tensor processing units. These are the new kids on the block. Right now, most AI gets done with GPUs because they have that parallel structure, but GPUs aren't actually ideal for AI. They bring a lot of spatial processing baggage that isn't actually ideal. And so TPUs were built from the ground up to really be designed to do what you want to see in AI inference. So when you go into ChatGPT and you type a question, being able to get an answer back quickly is going to be made more efficient to the extent that folks are using TPUs. And so TPUs use tensors. Tensors are essentially vectors, and by design, they hold high dimensional states across thousands of math units within the sort of TPU itself. The TPUs have a lot of knowledge built into them through all the AI training that they get. So all those months of AI training essentially are adjusting the parameters or weights within the TPU. So there's a lot of knowledge there. And then the inputs come in, and you can have different kinds of inputs coming in as waves to these chips all at once. So you could have the output of all your visual processing coming in. So your GPUs have kind of rendered the picture, okay, and they've just created the picture. They don't know what's in the picture. V1 doesn't know what is in the picture. It helps make the picture for your brain. But you also can have other kinds of non-sensory inputs like context. So for instance, you could have context coming in saying, I'm in a situation where I am very likely to see cats, or I'm very likely to see dogs. And that's not coming from visual cortex, that's probably coming from somewhere more in the front of the brain. And so this information comes in, and as it goes through the core, the way it works is each unit does its computation, combining its weights, its knowledge with the inputs, and then it passes that on to its neighbor, which does the same thing. And it passes it on to its neighbors in all direction, which does the same thing. And what essentially is going on here is it is integrating across all these inputs and the knowledge to come up with a singular gestalt or understanding of what is going on in light of the context that has come in. And that, to me, sounds a lot more like what you would want to see in any kind of appraisal process, super integrative. It also sort of has all these natural constraint satisfaction type features that we used to talk about a lot back in the 80s and 90s, where you can take ambiguous inputs, and because of the sort of knowledge base that's in the core and the inputs that sort of bias things towards certain expectations, the weights and parameters that are in the core kind of operate as a landscape, and they have these valleys, which are attractor states, where something that's ambiguous like this will naturally fall down into one of these attractor states very efficiently, and it will stay there because gravity sort of operates in this metaphorical landscape the same way it does here. Falling into an attractor state is easy, getting out of an attractor state is hard, and I think this is part of why we end up with problems like naive realism. There's a talk this afternoon on the my side bias. I think that that is related to kind of what's going on here. And tensor processing units have this kind of landscape built in, except unlike the CPUs that people used to run this back in the 90s, TPUs do it all in one iteration. They don't have to go through lots of iterations to get there. Okay, so what parts of the brain operate like a TPU? Well, my best guess is that there's two parts of the brain. The one that I am most focused on and interested in is TPJ, which is easy to remember. TPJ is a TPU. It's like written right out for you already. Tempoparietal junction is the region I'm talking about. I think this is part of a larger region that I will come back to in a few minutes. And then I think the second strong candidate is the posterior cingulate. And these two regions are incredibly interconnected with each other. I think they do a lot of work together. Both of them have cellular features, which I'm not really going to spend time on, that make them not likely to segregate incoming information, and especially likely to pass information across different cortical columns so that you do get the bleeding and integration that you would sort of expect to see from something that was like a tensor processing unit. Also, remember for the prefrontal cortex, we saw that these regions were highly insulated from sensory input, but TPJ and posterior cingulate are the least insulated regions in the default mode network, so they actually get lots of sensory input, and they also get lots of non-sensory input from the rest of the default mode network. So I think they're kind of ideally positioned in terms of bringing together these different kinds of information. And then the last two facts that kind of go together that I think are interesting about TPJ is that when you compare the human brain to the macaque brain, TPJ is literally the single region of the brain that has expanded the most between the macaque brain and the human brain. And it's also the region of the brain that has the most different functional connectivity fingerprint compared to the macaque brain. And so I at least like to think that part of what has happened is that this brain area has expanded to handle more complex computations that go beyond the more sort of sensory type of processes that a macaque might be doing to sort of handle more abstract semantics and socio-emotional inputs that we might want to process. Now, I mentioned that I thought TPJ was part of a larger region, and that region is what I refer to as Gestalt cortex. That I think that this is a region that's really responsible for a lot of sort of integration that ends up being part of our conscious experience. It includes TPJ kind of as the star, but it also goes under to areas like the fusiform face area and the parahippocampal gyrus and lateral occipital complex, but just the anterior portion of that. And I think that these regions collectively do a lot of the work in allowing us to do the kind of seeing that I was talking about previously. So just to sort of put it pretty explicitly at least once, I think that seeing via Gestalt cortex is the mind's way of effortlessly making sense of the world, how we instantly see not just shapes and colors, but meanings, intentions, and emotions. It describes the pre-reflective process by which Gestalt cortex weaves together sensory input, current expectations, and prior knowledge into a singular, coherent, subjective construal without us having to think about it. So let's get into some of the sort of psychological characteristics associated with these regions. So let's start by talking about the speed of the processing. We want our appraisal machine to be fast. For this next study, this is a study that we did in collaboration with neurosurgeons involving electrocorticography. If you don't want to see a picture of an open brain, now is the time to look away. So when we do electrocorticography, we are putting electrodes directly on the surface of the brain. And you can look back now if you happen to look away. With electrocorticography or ECOG, this really gives us kind of unparalleled spatial and temporal resolution. It has all sorts of other limitations, but for the places that you can get coverage, you're getting really refined spatial coverage and, millisecond temporal resolution as well. And this is really important for something like mentalizing, which I've studied a lot in my career, the ability to process other people's mental states. Because if you do an fMRI study of mentalizing, what you will always see is TPJ and dorsomedial prefrontal cortex come on together. They activate together in like 90% of mentalizing studies. And so you just sort of think, oh, they're kind of both doing the same thing. But when we can go in and get millisecond accuracy, the picture changes a fair bit. If we look at the first 250 milliseconds after a mentalizing task starts, and the task here is very, very simple. The task is something like you see the statement, my neighbor is generous, and you're simply saying yes or no. Okay? And in the first 250 milliseconds after the statement is shown, and they know what the form of the statement's going to look like, so there's no surprise. They know to just kind of look for the trait word at the end and so on. You already see some pretty decent TPJ activation sort of occurring within the first 250 milliseconds, but nothing is happening in the dorsomedial and medial prefrontal regions where you would typically see mentalizing type effects. But if you go to 750 to 1,000 milliseconds, now you see a lot of robust activity all over the brain, but the whole medial wall is now engaged. And if you look at this on a trial averaged way, you see that TPJ peaks at 400 milliseconds. It's significant before that, but it peaks at 400. Dorsomedial prefrontal peaks at 800. So it's half the speed of TPJ. In terms of being integrative, okay, there's a ton on TPJ and Gestalt cortex being sort of highly integrative. If you have damage to TPJ or Gestalt cortex, there's decent chance that you will end up being a simultagnosic, have simultagnosia, which is a condition which has been described as leaving a patient's world unglued, where the visual elements of the world do not cohere together. So if you show a simultagnosic this stimulus here, they will either report seeing just a blank circle with nothing filling it in, or they will report seeing a diagonal line. That's all they will get. And the rest of it is just out of their conscious experience, even though it's right in front of them. We take this for granted, but you need these regions sort of functioning properly for that to work. But in these same regions, if you get damage, you might also get transcortical aphasia, right? Which is a semantic deficit where you lose semantic concepts and you end up with Wernicke's type word salad, where you have the sound, the patter of normal speech, but nothing you're saying makes sense because you can no longer monitor the semantics of what you're saying and make sense of what it is that you are trying to produce. And there's also work showing that damage to this same region interferes with the ability to take two words and make a new singular concept out of those two words. So a plaid jacket is a singular thing. People with damage to this region can't put those words together and get the new concept effectively. Now I'll turn to the more psychological and social domain. So we know that there are parts of the ventral and posterior part of the brain that code things like bodies, faces, objects, and scenes. Okay? And Stefan Anzalotti did this really, I think, elegant study where he tracked where all of those things were in the brain, and then he built a computational model of what it would look like if a brain region was integrating all of those components into a single representation, which doesn't get you everything you would want from a subjective construal, but it gets you a lot. And it turns out there's only one region of the brain that integrates all four of these things, and that is TPJ in Gestalt cortex. Remember I said that 90% of mentalizing studies will show you TPJ and dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. Well, there's one kind of mentalizing study that only shows TPJ and the Gestalt cortex. Many of you have probably seen this video before. This is the Heider and Simmel fighting triangles. And when you watch this video, it is completely effortless mentalizing. You can't help but watch this and see these different shapes as having personalities, as having emotional experiences that are unfolding over the course of this narrative. You see them as having goals and intentions and just all sorts of psychological reactions. And when people watch these videos, they don't show any dorsomedial or medial prefrontal cortex. Instead, they show pretty much all of Gestalt cortex as they integrate these elements into a cohesive narrative that includes all these psychological elements. We want our appraisal machine to connect to consciousness, okay, to conscious experience. And my way of getting to this is idiosyncratic subjectivity. And by idiosyncratic subjectivity, what I mean is, any number of you that are sitting next to each other are watching this talk. The same photons are bouncing off the screen and hitting your eyes, and the sound waves are hitting your ears, but you're having totally different experiences because maybe some of you are interested in what I'm talking about, and others of you are just saying, how long is he going to keep us before we get to lunch? A little bit longer. And so I'm interested in that kind of idiosyncratic subjectivity, which we often study by looking at neural synchrony. Now, neural synchrony here means interpersonal neural synchrony, not the kind that's like functional connectivity within a brain. When we study neural synchrony with fMRI, we would typically show people a video, and then we would look in the same spot in 2 or more people's brains, and we look to see if the fluctuations are rising and falling together, or if they're doing different things, right? And if they're rising and falling together, we say, okay, that's high neural synchrony. But that high neural synchrony means different things in different parts of the brain. In primary auditory cortex, you get neural synchrony because we both have the same acoustic information hitting our ears, and that's all that drives synchrony there. In contrast, in regions like Gestalt cortex and TPJ, what you'll see is when people are watching a video or listening to a story, to the extent that afterwards they report experiencing that story in similar ways with similar narratives and similar interpretations, then they get very robust neural synchrony in TPJ, in other parts of Gestalt cortex, and not necessarily in a lot of other regions of the brain. You often don't see any medial prefrontal cortex in these types of studies. I published a meta-analysis of these kinds of studies last year, looking at synchrony studies where they quantified the differences between how people were experiencing things. And these studies are radically different. They cover any kind of content you could imagine, but they all have this feature of tracking when people see things similarly or differently. And when you look at the meta-analysis, the brain regions that consistently track the idiosyncratic subjectivity are Gestalt cortex, TPJ, and posterior cingulate. Okay. Now we're going to turn to emotional experience itself. I'm going to show you a couple of studies on this that I think speak directly to what's going on, not when we have emotional stimuli, but in our actual reported emotional experience. So we have this study from Taschereau and Dumichel where they showed people lots of pictures of animals that may or may not scare you, and they built 2 computational models. They built one model where they were using the brain activity to predict people's subjective experiences of fear as they saw these pictures, and they built another model that was meant to predict the galvanic skin response people had. And so they looked at, for each region of the brain, how well could it predict the conscious experience of emotion and the physiological response. And they first looked at which brain regions did one or the other significantly differently from each other. And the sort of 3 of the 4 horsemen of the emotional brain showed up as predicting physiological outcomes of the picture viewing very, very nicely. You know, core predictions at the level of like 0.8 classification accuracy. But none of them predicted anything about the emotional experience that people were having. Now, they showed the reverse as well, and if you knew the philosophical orientation of one of the authors, you would know there's a reason why they did this whole study to show that it was lateral prefrontal. They also show this chunk back here that's in the area that I care about, but there's some other interesting things kind of hidden in this figure. First of all, almost the rest of Gestalt cortex is in orange. And orange just means it's all trending in the direction of being sensitive to the subjective experience more than the physiological response. But the most interesting thing is here in the heart of TPJ. This looks like nothing's going on here, right? This color green is right in the middle of the distribution, so it looks like nothing's going on here. It's actually the most interesting spot in the whole figure, and you have to go to the supplementary materials to find out why, because everything on this plot is about what was significantly higher for one than the other. And it turns out that TPJ is actually a better predictor of their subjective experience of fear than any region they're showing on this map, but it's also a really good predictor of the physiological outcome. And so it shows up as non-significant here. If I was writing this paper, that would have been the star of the paper, but for them, they don't even mention it except in the supplemental. Here's a paper where they had people watch the entire movie Forrest Gump, and then they did this in the scanner, and then out of the scanner they made emotional experience ratings as they watched it again moment by moment, and they computed 3 appraisal dimensions: polarity, complexity, and intensity. And then they looked for gradients in the brain, parts of cortex where you could basically see across that part of cortex it going from one end of these appraisal dimensions to the other. There was one spot in the brain that coded for all 3 appraisal dimensions. That was TPJ. Last of these studies that I will show you, it's one of my new favorite studies. This is from a group in China. They had 5 participants watch over 2,000 videos in the scanner. They had a lot of scanner time over there, I guess. And they were short videos, some were only 15 seconds. So they watched 2,200 videos in the scanner, and then they watched them again outside the scanner, making 34 subjective experience ratings of every one of those. That is an ungodly number of ratings if you sort of do the math. And then they used that to get 4 appraisal dimensions, which they called arousal, approach, attention, and commitment. And then what they did is they said, okay, now let's go look at the brain, and using this model, let's see where in the brain we can predict the activity in the brain as they watch these videos as a function of the subjective ratings they had. They used 1,800 videos to train up the model, and then the last 360 models were a fresh test. So these were uncontaminated by anything in the model building. And they found that across the entire brain, about a quarter of the brain's activity, the quarter of the voxels in the brain, could be predicted from these subjective ratings. So remember this 24% value, because that's your base rate, and that's going to be relevant for the next couple things I'm going to show you. Let's go back to our 4 horsemen of the emotional brain. The percentage of voxels that they showed, 0 in both the amygdala and ventral striatum. They were not predictable by these subjective ratings at all. Insula and ventromedial, they did better. They were up around 20%. But remember, that is lower than the brain's base rate average. So it's still not great. When you put all this together, the 4 horsemen are getting you 16%, all driven by the insula and ventromedial. Now let's go look at the lateral cortex. Visual cortex, 17% of the voxels could be predicted, slightly better than the 4 horsemen of the emotional brain. The prefrontal cortex, 26%, right kind of at the sort of brain's average, and that is mostly driven by dorsolateral and dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. Ventromedial and orbital frontal are bringing this number down. But then we go to Gestalt cortex, and none of these compare. It's 48% for Gestalt cortex. Across this entire sort of space of Gestalt cortex, 48% of the voxel's activity could be predicted by these emotion ratings. And then they did sub-areas. The two highest sub-areas in the brain were both in Gestalt cortex. One was TPJ at 54%. The other was lateral occipital complex, just the anterior part that's in Gestalt cortex at 69%. We think of this as an object perception region, and look at what it's doing for something that kind of looks like emotional appraisal. If Matilda's here, the slide's for you. She had a poster that had lateral occipital complex yesterday. And then finally, they put all of the appraisal gradients on this flat map, which if you don't live with flat maps, this looks like nonsense. But I converted it to basically a regular brain, and 3 of these 4 appraisal gradients are living inside Gestalt cortex and posterior cingulate. So I think that Gestalt cortex with posterior cingulate starts to give us, I think, a place to be going forward with, because I think it has the speed, I think it has the nuance, and I think it has the tendency to sort of integrate into coherent wholes that might satisfy the demands we would want for appraisal. Now, one final little chunk before I finish. So I think this has implications for how we go study emotion going forward. We tend to do our neuroscience of the emotions by putting people in MRI scanners, but James Gross has this really nice study from 15 years ago where he asked people where they experienced different emotions, and one of the things that came out of that study is that most people experience emotions in front of someone else. And they also tell other people about their emotional experiences. And a good chunk of the time, their experiences come not just in front of someone else, but in interaction with someone else. And so if we're putting people in scanners to study emotion, we're missing a lot of where and how emotion actually unfolds in everyday life. In ancient history in our research, we used to go out to the world where things were happening and sort of maintain this social realism of trying to sort of look at the world as it was unfolding and make observations. The limitations there is you couldn't get inside anyone's head. And so as we got personal computers, we started moving towards what I call cubicle psychology, where we put people alone in a cubicle, we put some things on a screen and said, do psychology. And then, folks like me came along, 20 years later and said, hold my beer, I can make it even worse. We're gonna put you in a coffin where you are the most isolated you could possibly be, and now we're gonna ask you to do emotion, and we're gonna assume it's the same thing that happens out there. And this is what led me to mostly give up fMRI and to switch to functional near-infrared spectroscopy, which is portable, it's mobile. It lets us do most of what we'd want to do with fMRI. The resolution is terrible, but if what you're interested in is a big chunk of the side of the cortex that's TPJ or Gestalt cortex, which I've tried to convince you is a really key indicator of emotional experience, then I think you can be in business doing something like this. Here's a study showing that people who watched an emotional video, these are their ratings over time, and the more similar their ratings are, their subjective ratings, the more synchrony they show in Gestalt cortex. This is a study where we went out to where a bunch of CEOs were hanging out for a weekend, people who run companies. They were never going to come to my lab, but we went to them, we showed them videos of CEOs talking about feeling burned out. We scanned their brains, and based on their synchrony profiles, we could predict, based on their subjective reactions embedded in the TPJ response, we could, classify with pretty high accuracy whether these CEOs were currently feeling overwhelmed at work. We bring in groups of people, teams, and we have them work together as teams multiple times over the course of a month. Each time the team comes in, they're wearing FNIRs, they're doing cooperative tasks, they're doing creative tasks, and from their neural synchrony profile, and just note, this is a real picture from a sample. Look at all the emotion that they're experiencing that you would probably never see in an MRI scanner, right? This is real life emotion. We can predict their performance on the cooperative tasks and the creative tasks, and there's a very interesting reason why the regression lines are in opposite directions. But we can also predict their emotional well-being while working as part of these teams. We bring in strangers and we have them talk to each other, and you can see there's so much emotional intensity going on in this. This was just a group that was one of our groups of participants. They're talking about where to hide during a zombie apocalypse in this video clip, and it's very interesting to listen to as well. And so with our FNIRs, we were able to get data simultaneously from default mode network, from frontoparietal, dorsal attention, ventral attention, and it turns out that only neural synchrony in the default mode network predicts how they feel about the conversation, whether they feel connected to the other person, they like the other person, that sort of thing. We go in the other direction, bring in romantic couples. Start with a friendly conversation, then we make them talk about something that they've already told us they disagree about all the time. So now they start arguing, and we see big drops in Gestalt cortex neural synchrony when they start arguing because they are no longer seeing eye to eye. See, the metaphor just keeps working. We bring in politically polarized people. To do this in America, we had to get people from UCLA, which is all liberal, and people from Texas, where they're all conservative. These are actually just both people from my lab, but we got people from Texas. We sent one of our rigs down there. We had them come online and talk about things like immigration and gun control. And when they talked, their neural synchrony in all these networks plummeted, unless they started by having a bonding conversation first, and then they stay at 0. Last thing I will show you. We're working with teams out where they live in the world. These are actual music production teams in Hollywood, California, working to make new music, like hip hop music. And you can just see all the rich emotional stuff that's going on here that we can capture because we're going to them and we're still letting them do what they do. And so the upside is, I think that people should think about, if you want to study the neuroscience of emotion, there's a way to get the social realism and the process assessment together, right, in one place. And I think tools like near-infrared spectroscopy are one of the tools that can get us there. So I want to thank all of the folks who have been in my lab and are in my lab that have done this amazing work. And thank you for listening for way longer than you were supposed to. Thank you very much.